All right, we just started the webinar, so we'll wait like a couple more seconds to let people join and then we'll get started. All right, we got a good amount coming in. So I will get started. Let's put this stuff in. And good evening. Welcome to tonight's live event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Shani from Greenlight, and I'm excited to be welcoming you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with Chris Herring about his new book, Blood in the Garden, The Flagrant History of the 1990s New York Knicks. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I want to say a huge thanks to Chris, Patrick, David, and the team at Atria Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event. The first is a chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon, where you can post your comments and thoughts. And if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons, and we'll only be pulling questions from there. Tonight's featured book, Blood in the Garden, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. At both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the link in the chat. As a thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book. Enter the code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section at the checkout online for 10% off. Your series hosts for Squawkin Sports are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. David was an editor at Deadspin and is now a co-founder and co-owner at Defector.com. His writing has appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, Food and Wine, and The Baffler. They'll be speaking with featured author Chris Herring, a senior writer for Sports Illustrated. He previously spent 5 years covering the NBA for ESPN and 538, and prior to that spent 7 years at the Wall Street Journal, where he covered the New York Knicks. He lives in Chicago and teaches at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism in his spare time. Chris's new book, Blood in the Garden, is a definitive history of the 1990s New York Knicks, illustrating how Pat Riley, Patrick Ewing, John Starks, Charles Oakley, and Anthony Mason resurrected the iconic franchise through oppressive physicality and unmatched grit. Chris is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then I'll be talking with Patrick and David and with all of you. So take it away, Chris.
Thank you so much for that and for everybody that's on and for inviting me to be on with you. I really appreciate it. Let me try to read this so we don't use the whole hour just on my reading and my lengthy resume there. I'll read from chapter 5, which is called Chalk Outline. Somehow Pat Riley either hadn't heard or understood the disclaimer. So when the handouts made their way around the conference room table at the Madison Square Garden offices in Midtown, Riley grabbed the sheet of photo paper, analyzed it, then wore a confused look. What he saw was unambiguous, an aerial half-court image of the garden floor with the chalk outline of a human body lying in the blue painted area directly in front of the basket. The messaging was blunt. If an opposing player had the audacity to drive toward the rim against New York, he might lose his life doing it. Beneath the image, there was a phrase, tough town, tough team, the 1992-93 New York Knicks. Before Riley could even fully digest the first image, another handout made the rounds. This one was just as direct as the first, featuring a Mack truck roaring through the middle of the page, coming right at the reader. If you want to know what it's like to play the Knicks, stand here, it read. Again, beneath the image was the slogan, tough town, tough team, the 1992-93 New York Knicks. A few of the team's executives chuckled at the mock-ups, which had been presented by a visiting ad agency. But then an uncomfortable Riley spoke up. I think these might go a little bit too far, he said. That's when the presenter reiterated what Riley must have somehow missed to start the meeting, that the promotional poster ideas for the 1992-93 season were just icebreakers, and that the unusually aggressive designs, accurate as their portrayals were, would never actually see the light of day. Still, the mock-ups illustrated something. In just 1 year, Riley's rough and tumble Knicks had developed an unmistakable identity.
All right. Welcome, everybody. It's been a minute since we were together. This is the book, if you have not seen it. It is, I believe this is our first New York Times bestseller.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't know that it was a bestseller, but anecdotally, I've been seeing it everywhere. Like I was in line at the Strand behind somebody who was buying it. I saw someone reading it on the train the other day. All of this was before I read it, but that's how you know you made it. So congrats on making it.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me, and for that. It's still a little bit hard to kind of fathom just all that, and the pictures of people on the train or in the park and what have you is just a huge lift for me. And when you put this much time into something, so again, I'm really honored to be on with you guys. Thank you.
Before we get into the nitty gritty and the extreme Pat Riley weirdness, I mean, the biggest takeaway for me is Pat Riley's fucking insane,
Yeah.
which we will get to.
Mhm.
But I wanted to ask you, just tell us about, there's a very moving part of the acknowledgements. And I just wanted to share the story about your dad and how the role he played in this book coming together, which I thought was really, really nice.
Sure. Well, my dad passed away, and in 2018, a few months before I got asked to take part in this project or to do this project. So he was, not he, but just kind of everything surrounding that, because it was unexpected, was a reason for me to initially say no to it. Just trying to get over that and trying to really exhale after a loss like that. And I want to say that just kind of cyber stalking you a little bit, Patrick, I think this is something that you've been through yourself. It's difficult. You don't wish that on anybody, to lose a parent, certainly at a relatively young age. But the one thing I knew about my dad, who has not a ton of published books, but several, as a professor, and a pretty well-esteemed professor, he had always wanted me to write my own book, and would always ask me, have you been given thought to what you'll do one on? And he would always throw ideas to me and stuff like that, and always loved my work, promoted my work. My mom, who I also lost in 2008, were huge fans and promoters and just supporters of my work. So as I thought about it more, and I thought about kind of how young I am and the fact that I don't have a family, I'm not married, I might not ever have this much freedom of time. Again, not that I'm someone that has, oodles and oodles of time, but just as far as responsibilities outside of myself. So I thought about it more, and I realized that, it could be a way to kind of honor what my dad had wanted me to do, let alone, obviously, there's, financial opportunities in it as well. But, as I said in the acknowledgements at the very beginning, I just hope it, if it's even something that could make them proud, or more proud for even just a moment, it's something that was worth doing.
I just love it. Such a dad move to
Yeah.
keep coming back to what have you been thinking about? Here's some ideas. Here's 12 ideas I have. Especially since your dad has written books.
All these blue chip jobs, and he's like, terrific, that's great, I'm glad that you're getting paid every 2 weeks. Have you thought about, this is something I was thinking about, The Life of Maurice Cheeks? It's a book.
My dad,
I wish my dad's book ideas had been that, like that would be on the high end of like what he was suggesting. He did have one idea that I watched become a bestseller for someone else, but the other person had better access to it.
I did say, Dad, once to my dad, I've never offered you any pediatrician ideas. Not one time. Not one time. I'm now 37 years old. Please stop. And the second question I wanted to ask you before we get to the book is, how old were you growing? Where did you grow up, and how old were you during this time period? Because I'm guessing I'm a lot older than you. I'm just curious, as it was something you followed as a kid? Was it something you came back to from history? What was your relationship to these teams and that era?
Well, there really was none as far as the relationship. You're a little bit older than me. I just turned 35. But that makes both of us really young for this era. I was 4 when Pat Riley got hired by the Knicks. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. So 91 was the first year the Bulls won a title. Riley was hired in 91. They played against the Bulls with Riley as the coach for the first time in 92. So I was, not cognizant of that being rivalry. Even once I was a little bit older, 8 or 9, which was probably the last time the two teams played against each other in the playoffs. By the time Jeff Van Gundy was the coach, I had no knowledge of the fact that the Knicks were a rival of the Bulls. I keep saying to people, the only thing I kind of had established by the time I was getting closer to 8, 9, 10 was that the Bulls had parades every summer and that Michael Jordan was the best player every, in of the era and, in the league. So I certainly knew that. I certainly knew they won a lot of games. I didn't know that it was not standard fare for other cities to also have parades. There might as well have been like a back to school parade here in Chicago or something like that, as far as how frequently they're happening. But, so I grew up as a Bulls fan, but not, I don't even know if I can really describe myself as a diehard, because to me, diehard loyalty fandom is that you don't turn away from the team, kind of thick or thin, good or bad. Nah, the Bulls were really, really great when I was a kid. And then all of a sudden they started drafting high schoolers and stuff. And Michael Jordan wasn't here, right, and Tim Floyd. And I was like, nah, fuck this. So, I was out very quickly. And so I didn't have any relationship with really, certainly the Knicks. I didn't know anything about them. I'd heard of Patrick Ewing, but that was about it. And as far as the Bulls were concerned, I was a fan, but literally just of them. I didn't really know who they were up against every year or how good those teams were, or why they wouldn't have liked those teams. I didn't have any real recollection of that or anything.
And on some level, I think that must have been because, the old head thing about the Knicks and the Bulls, which I was there for all of it, but I was neither. I rooted for the Knicks because I just never really liked the Bulls. Went to college with all guys from Chicago during that first run, and that really turned me off to Chicago winning anything ever. really, as long as I live. But the old head Knicks guard must have had a lot to say to you if you wanted to listen. But I think it probably to some advantage to not being of that era and that sort of, you should have seen the rivalry. Somebody got their head chopped off every game, and then they keep playing, and it was the toughest. All that, which lingers to this day, unfortunately.
Probably some, yeah. I mean, I did an appearance with Scott Van Pelt on SportsCenter, and that was one of the first things he asked about was, like, you probably have a level of objectivity here that maybe most people felt so passionately about those Knicks teams if you lived in New York, and then if you lived in Chicago too. So maybe the fact that I was born a little bit later was helpful. But I covered the Knicks for the Wall Street Journal. I started covering the league like right in the middle of that D Rose Bulls era, which, people here from Chicago were. I've tried to think of which teams since those Knicks have been like most similar, where there's just like a rabid, diehard fandom and like passionate love between the city and the team. And, those Taj Gibson, Joakim Noah, Derrick Rose era Bulls, even down to like Rose being from here and, Anthony Mason, obviously a little bit different when you have an MVP that, grew up in Chicago. But I mean, just the love affair between the teams and the grit that they played with, I think that there was a lot of, and the fact that, I think most people would have looked at those Bulls teams and said, like, there is one superstar. There is just a lot of love between the city and the way the city views itself. And even though you have wealthy people in Chicago and New York, like the blue collar nature of kind of what the city's roots are. So I grew up here and, had a lot of friends here and stuff like that and come back to visit here a lot, but I wasn't a diehard fan. I wasn't even really a Bulls fan by that point when I was covering the league. So it wasn't difficult for me. To me, I think that was actually one of the other upsides when I was approached to do the book, was that they figured because he's not old enough to have really been in love with either of these teams or any of these teams, that he won't take for granted what he already knows about those teams. So he'll dig harder to find more information and to get stuff that's never been out there. So I hope that was a benefit. But, I guess people that lived it would have to tell me better than I could really tell them.
This would be a great opportunity for me to weigh in as someone who fucking hated those teams and did watch them all the way through. I grew up in New Jersey as a New Jersey Nets fan, which was not
okay.
But there's little moments in here that were sort of mildly triggering. Derek Coleman getting his face busted open and then not getting stitches for like 10 minutes because the Knicks would let the physician down from the rafters to do it. Saw that game on TV, didn't care for it at all. But there was but at the same time, I will say this much about the book. As somebody who did not love those Knicks teams, and certainly didn't love the, experience of watching them play. It wasn't beautiful basketball. Like, it was not even identifiable really as the same sport as the basketball that gets played today, really. Like, it was sort of like maybe like Big Ten type bloodlines, but it, like, NBA games just don't look like that anymore. I will say the book gave me not just like a sort of a greater appreciation for the team. Obviously, it's easier to appreciate them when you don't have to watch them play. That part of it goes a long way. But there was in this book too, like, the dynamic within the team, I think, was like sort of well known because they were so extravagantly covered. I mean, like, people love them. There's, two tabloids that were all out like on them all the time, because there was always like drama and shit, that there was always like some story that like the Post would want to cover about like Anthony Mason fighting 9 guys at the Olive Garden in Times Square or something. But you did get at like, I don't think it was at the Olive Garden, but it was like, and
it could have been, knowing Mason. It could have been,
though. Right? Like, you had to ask.
It very easily.
Who said I was family?
Yeah. But there's something about, I mean, the people that talked to you were very honest. So you didn't get to talk to Anthony Mason because he passed, it seems. But the way that the team functioned together and under Riley, that belief, I think, was like not as understood at the time. I mean, like, it was understood that they were rough and tough and they pushed each other hard in practice and stuff like that. It seemed like they really sustained each other in kind of an interesting way that was not a part of the official story about that like, just the degree of like hard-assness all up and down the roster seemed like there was a lot more discipline than the team ever really got credit for, like internally enforced, not just from Riley. Like, what was it about reading about, I mean, obviously you didn't have to watch them, but like, what there surprised you in terms of like what you learned about, especially the sort of the Riley first half of the 90s teams?
No, I think you're spot on. First of all,
Thanks.
is that they certainly, I mean, they were emotion filled, I think is probably the best way to put it. They could fly off the handle, but you can't be the best defense in the league 3 years in a row without discipline. Like, you can't play for Pat Riley without a relative degree of discipline. I mean, as you know from having read it, he basically lived by the credo that you're either all the way in or all the way out. And, he realistically threatened and actually was going to kick Mason off the playoff roster, like arguably their best defender, their best rebounder, and maybe their best passer, was just going to kick the man off the roster for having questioned him on, like, Anthony Mason basically felt like he was the best offensive option at small forward for them, better than Charles Smith. And one game, Riley decided to ride with Charles Smith at the end of the game, and Mason was frustrated that he didn't get to play in the fourth quarter. And Mason questioned Riley, basically saying that Charles Smith was the best option at that point. And Riley, when Mason made that known and pushed the issue, and then, after Riley suspended him for a game, Anthony Mason then came to that game and sat in the crowd in a Rangers jersey and the third deck.
The 300 seats too.
And the 300 seats.
That's when I moved to New York that year, and so wasn't that
Holy
the
hell.
Knicks. I rooted against the Bulls, but I moved to New York the year the Rangers and the Knicks both go to the finals, and I was living in the Bronx working for Jesuit volunteers. So I didn't have any money, so I would just take the train to hang around the Garden and sneak into the Irish bars. I could always get some Catholic to buy me drinks, but I remember all of these things vividly. I remember Mason in the jersey running around. And the place went, it was just bedlam. And
yeah, completely. And like Marv Albert was like, and I think Anthony Mason in the third deck. And, the players could hear it on the ground, on the floor. And it just blew up. Like this was back in the day where they did not have the capability of like getting the stuff quickly with TV cameras. And so they had to do like a freeze frame of having seen like this big blur of Anthony Mason in the third deck.
Like
it was really, TV production was so bad. Yeah, it was so bad. But Riley literally like suspended Mason indefinitely over that. It happened with like 2 or 3 games left in the season. And he told Dave Checketts, the team president, and Ernie Grunfeld, the GM, that he fully intended to leave him off the playoff roster until they basically intervened and said, you can't do that because we'll have literally no chance in the playoffs. So they left him on. But I mean, that was how, probably the craziest anecdote I've got on Riley. Not the craziest because there are a lot, but I mean, he literally would take issue with, you know, his boss, Dave Checkett's, his wife getting a family car for the Checkett's family. Riley was like on him seriously and really frustrated and annoyed by the fact that they were about to get a green Chevy Suburban. And then when Riley shouted him down about that, they were going to get a red Chevy Suburban. And Riley basically told him, you cannot do that. Green represents the Celtics and red represents the Bulls. Like, that was betrayal to him. The dude was just like not wired in a normal way. But so to play for Riley, the discipline that you had to have, generally speaking, you know, he'd make exceptions every now and then because he was forced to by his bosses. But this was a really rigid dude as far as the way he handled stuff. And the Knicks were more skilled and more disciplined than they got credit for. Now they also were, again, they were emotion filled in a way that I think came back to bite them in the ass, but they were very, very disciplined on offense too, but not nearly talented enough, I think, on offense.
I knew that the Showtime three-peat Riley was kind of the Gordon Gekko thing was sort of a bit of a Hollywood put on or a role he started playing. I knew there was this sort of the Schenectady, is that right? Sort of the street rat kid from upstate. So the gritty New York thing, it made sense, and it made sense that maybe that's actually how he would have played. The weirdness, though, off the pale, I did not know he was so strange. And I thought I'd read enough about him, but the fact
contract
that
negotiation stuff was great. I was going to ask about that too.
Well, I want to tell the story if you would real quick, because I still don't really believe it, but the fact that they might believe it is true about Rolando Blackman asking if his wife can come on a trip to the NBA Finals as a reward. Not just his wife, but the other wives could come. And what does Pat Riley say to that, and where does that potentially go?
Sure. So I'll try to be quick about it. The Knicks had won, you know, as people know, Game 7 in the 94 Eastern Conference Finals to beat the Pacers. Nobody on that Knicks roster had ever won a championship before, except for Riley as the coach, with the 4 titles he won with the Lakers. So Rolando Blackman, looking at the fact that the Knicks have played a 7-game series against the Bulls, obviously with the Hubert Davis, you know, Scottie Pippen, Hugh Hollins play.
And Blackman's a well-respected veteran at this point. If you don't know who he is, he's been in the league a long time, made a few all-star teams.
Yeah, the leading scorer at that point in history for the Dallas Mavericks franchise. Even to this day, I think Dirk is the only guy that's outscored him. So, you know, they had been through 2 7-game series, a really emotional Game 7 win that they won in the last minute. And they get to the locker room, and Rolando Blackman, after they've kind of, you know, huddled up and Riley's congratulated them, he says, "Can we bring our wives?" Which is actually a really smart move, because, you know, who says no at a time like that? Because you're euphoric in that moment. It's, you know, it's a career achievement to make it that far. And, you know, he says, "We'd like to bring our wives."
Wife guy play right there.
It completely was. And actually, some of the guys have told me, Harper, Doc Rivers said that Rolando specifically was the one to ask it. And that was kind of planned, because he was someone that hadn't really been in the rotation all year and wasn't like, you know, at some level they felt like, well, there's not as much to be lost here, but also he can't say no to this guy because he's so respected. And so, but Riley says no instantly. And Rolando, you know, again, in great esteem with everyone, you know, nice guy, the nicest guy you could possibly meet, but well-respected. He pushes the issue a little bit. And he says, "Pat, I don't understand. Like, we just made it to the finals. These aren't like, you know, these are not just any women. These are our wives. You know, they hold our families down when we're gone. It's been a really long season. It's been a really hard season. All we're asking is that they be able to come down to Houston." And, you know, because the first 2 games of that series were going to be in Houston, and Riley said no again. So and he was just as emphatic about it, you know, the second time. So, you know, the part that you're asking about specifically is the question, which Rolando, Doc, Oakley, Derek Harper all have. And I think Riley kind of maybe played into this as well. The idea of when John Starks eventually shoots 2 for 18 in Game 7, how much consideration was there given to replacing John, even just briefly, with Rolando Blackman. Hubert Davis was like a second-year player at this point. And, everybody kept saying that he kind of looked a little bit afraid of the moment to come in, and just during the series that maybe the moment was a little bit big for him. But Rolando, for his career, had killed the Rockets. The best scoring average of his career against any team was against the Houston Rockets. The best scoring average of his career was against the Houston Rockets. And again, he played for the Dallas Mavericks. So this is a team that is in close proximity in the same division. I talked to Scott Brooks on the other bench, from the Rockets during those years. And he said, we were petrified of the guy because we'd never been able to stop. We never had an answer for him. And we just kind of assumed that when John is shooting this poorly, you've got a young Hubert Davis and you've got Rolando Blackman. Of course, you're going to go with Rolando, even though he hadn't played to that point in the series. Like, this is the time that you break the emergency glass. But it never happened. And Rolando was left wondering, and the other guys feel this way pretty firmly, that was the reason that he didn't get an opportunity. I did not get to speak to Pat for the book. I made every effort. I went to Schenectady for the better part of a week in the raging snow to talk with all his childhood friends to try to win him over from that standpoint to get the interview. And then even when I did not get it, I sent him a laundry list of questions, detailed, pointed questions about his tactics, about his thinking, including this. And he did not take the bait on it, but he did write Rolando what I think could maybe be construed as apology letters, handwritten letters to Rolando over the years. And he's called it the biggest mistake he ever made in his career to not put him in the game. Whether he actually believed that, I'm not sure.
But even knowing some of the other guys did believe that the asking the wives could come to the finals was on his brain at some point at the pinnacle moments of Game 7. It just goes to show how much stranger a human being I think he's certainly than I knew. I don't know about you, Dave. I thought he was a lot weirder than I'd ever known.
Yeah, he's an incredible character in this, especially given, I think, Chris, that you didn't get to talk to him. I mean, just like the sort of the portrait of him that emerges as not just as, like a guy who's super driven to, like get the team, all the things that we associate with the Heat now. I mean, just like the best conditioned team, the most like locked in team, and the most like hyper psychotically competitive team. Beyond the rest of it, though, there's like all of the sort of the front office stuff, the attempt to not just to negotiate the richest contract, but to get a 10% ownership stake in the team, to get insisting on a per diem when he's getting paid like 10, or when he was looking for $5 million a year or something like that. Like, he just was a guy that couldn't stop competing in any facet of his life, apparently.
Completely. And that's the thing that I can't really reconcile that on a personal level, but that's why I wanted to take myself out of this. Like, me personally, with regards to the Rolando Blackman thing, me personally, I can't imagine that that's why Riley held him out. I would love, and I recall, he didn't play much that year. He played a little bit in the playoff series, and Rolando told me, and this is the way Pat was wired. Rolando said that he'd played, because when Rolando came over, he was like super polite dude, but he was extremely adamant about one point where I think I said, you were brought in and, were kind of brought in as one of the highest profile guys they brought in that second year Riley was there, as a guy that could, either start or come off the bench. He was like, no, let's not get it twisted. I came in to start. That was discussed. That was like, look at my track record before that. John Starks was not the John Starks that like he would be for his career yet. He was still a young up and coming guy. So they brought me in as kind of the veteran two guard to shore up their scoring. And I was that guy. I was a 4-time All-Star. I was the leading scorer in Mavericks history. Like, I was that guy. But what ended up happening, he played really crappy in that first year he was in New York, because basically the way he described it to me, he described it, he said it felt like someone was plunging like a sword in between his muscles and his back. He basically said like he had a bulging disc in his back. He tried to play through it to the point where he was taking loads of pills every day, pain pills. And he was like, it was horrible because I couldn't feel anything. Just playing a game, not being able to feel. Like, it's great that you don't feel the pain, but you also couldn't feel a damn thing else. So he tried to play through that the whole season. Basically, the day the season ended, he had surgically repaired and he was better by the next year. But what he said repeatedly is like, it was so tough. And the reason that I didn't get surgery that first year is I kind of had heard from a lot of people that the minute you have to step back or step down out of the rotation in Riley's world, you're done. And he felt that way even in the second season once he was healthy, that like he had kind of lost his opportunity essentially. So he again, if this is me just writing it, my own opinion, my own take, kind of what I think, I would not have even really brought up the Rolando stuff. But I think it's really relevant. Exactly what Patrick said is that the fact that a third or half the team thought that Riley even had it in his mind to potentially hold him out tells you the way that they viewed his mindset, and that he might be that petty, or that he might be hold that much of a grudge over something like that, even to the point where Rolando, like a perfectly level-headed, rational dude, that they all think that Riley potentially had it in him to do that. Me personally, I just think that Starks had played lights out in games 4, 5, and 6, really games 2 through 6, and that he was their best option because Patrick wasn't playing well in that series. But again, I'm not going to leave out. I'm trying to be a fly on the wall in this book for the most part. So I was certainly not going to leave out that 4 or 5 guys had all said, we think this is why Pat left him out, and that it was wrong of Pat to do that. So that was why it was included.
There's also, I remember watching the game itself. Sometimes it's almost like Starks was so bad, you assumed he was going to turn at some point. Like, it wasn't like he was shaky. It was just sort of like, oh, he's, I don't know, something is off. He'll definitely fix it. 'Cause he was kind of a streaky shooter anyway. And that just hit a point where, because that is the thing where I have a hard time believing Riley was thinking, but also because of what was the moment, you know, did you go to the fourth quarter? Like, it wasn't like, you know, he wasn't hurt or whatever. And it's, in some ways, Starks was so bad that it seemed he couldn't be, you couldn't believe what you were watching, and it'll have to turn quick enough. And it was close, and the game was close, or close enough. So
6 points.
That I always thought that, like, after the fact, I'm like, why didn't he put in Blackman? But I zipped through some of the tape, but I don't remember any announcer mentioning that. That didn't seem like a thing that was said right away. It seemed like maybe
The only thing they say, you've got Marv Albert and Matt Gukas on basically saying how, like, even if Stark struggles, that it's pretty, they're assuming that Riley will stay with them. Now, you don't assume that he'll struggle to the tune of 2 for 18.
Right.
I think Marv mentioned something when Starks is 1 for 7. And then I think maybe Gukas mentioned something when he's like 1 for 10. But I don't know that the other thing that, you know, was a logical step is like, okay, stop shooting, stay in the game, but stop shooting. And, you know, and there were guys that started, you know, said to me in the book, maybe I should have stopped going to him with the ball. Like Derek Harper's kind of blamed himself, saying, I was the point guard, I didn't have to send the ball his way. And again, I don't think that pulling him from the game means like you have to bench him for the rest of it. Riley could have pulled him for 2 minutes to let him just catch his breath. And, you know, none of those options were obviously utilized. Nobody actually gave in on that line of thinking, but they were all, again, it's certainly easy to say in hindsight. I've said that I don't necessarily think that's why Riley made that decision, but I do think it's fascinating to me that guys that had that much on the line think that might have had a part in it.
Yeah. It's like the other side of the intensity that the team played with is that, like, there's, and you write about this very well, that like Starks had like basically hadn't been sleeping, you know, I mean, was just like, was way in his head about this in a way that is honestly, like, by pro athlete standards, like pretty easy to relate to. Like, I mean, he just was really like, the moment was maybe getting the better of him. And it was like, for a guy that played that way, to whom like being that intense was so like essential to his performance, like, yeah, that's always the sort of risk. It's not like Don Nelson's a laid back guy, but so after Riley leaves, the little brief Don Nelson experiment, it's like a nice little comic, like palate cleansing bit in the book.
Well, especially now that he's like Lebowski, he's like,
yes,
Captain
yeah,
Reed. He seems like that's the chill Uncle Don over there, but right. He just comes off like a buffoon.
He comes off a little bit like a buffoon, but also like it just is a reminder of what fucking maniacs these guys were, because he came in and he was like, you guys have off from practice today, or like, we're not doing 2-a-days. And it was like, it seemed like he lost the clubhouse to a certain extent just by being fairly chill in some ways. Like, then he lost it because he made bad decisions and got loaded in, you know, Boston or whatever. But there was, it was such a weird like culture clash. The idea of like just going from like, they needed Van Gundy because they needed like another guy who would sleep in the office, it seemed like.
Well, it also sucks too that they had the point forward of Don Nelson's like had Mason, and then had they given it a real try, that could have been pretty astounding. Because I remember when he had what's that guy's name? Tom Tolbert playing point forward. Was that not on one of his teams?
Yeah.
I
He
think Mason,
wanted a big guy dribbling the ball up the floor, and
Yeah,
he
he
had one that could
loved it.
actually do it finally, and that guy didn't trust him at all.
He knew it before he even took the job. I mean, that was his first question for the Knicks when they were interviewing him was, you guys are going to re-sign Mason, right? Because he wanted him as his point forward. This was a guy that had Manute Bol spotting up for threes and was running plays to get that set, and had Tim Hardaway posting up in the, on the block. So he was a guy that thought backwards and wanted to kind of make weird things work, which is kind of the name of the game now. Now it's not even viewed as weird because it's just kind of standardized to have inverted play calls and stuff like that. But I make that point in the book really at the end of that chapter with Don Nelson, which is called Whack-a-Mole, because there were just so many problems that cropped up every time anything would happen. Something else would come up, a death threat from Anthony Mason, him talking to Patrick Ewing and offending him.
Death threat.
Handwritten death threat.
What a polite move.
Yes. The nice little Valentine's card. But it was just, it was a team that I think he had the right ideas for the team, but you needed like more of a transition between. And by the way, like, I think it's really interesting too that the Knicks, it had been out there that they wanted to hire Chuck Daly, but I think the fact that Chuck Daly might have been like the most perfect replacement for Pat Riley. And also if they do that, and if they had been able to do it, which it sounded like maybe there was a window to get him, even once he said no, that a pretty key person in the organization said that Chuck Daly circled back 2 days later after turning the job down and basically said he made a mistake in turning it down and still wanted in and wanted the job. And, whether the Knicks, whether it happened that way or whether he came back a year later, whatever it was. But Don Nelson was such a polar opposite from Riley that I think the team, whether they liked Riley or not by that point, and I think some of the guys still respected him, Don Nelson was just too far in the other direction. Riley would practice him for 3.5 hours. Nelson would barely practice him for an hour. Riley had practices that basically got to the point of being boring for his scouts and people to come watch. They would be excited to see like the great master Pat Riley, how he practices his team, but then they just practice defense for 3 hours. Don Nelson doesn't have a single defensive drill in his practice. Don Nelson's playbook is so hard to understand that the assistant coaches like can't get the quizzes right when they're handed out to the team, and he's charging players by the wrong answer in those quizzes, $5-10 per wrong answer, and he's getting like $600 off the team for one quiz. So it was pretty bad. Not to mention that his relationship with Ewing was off on the wrong foot from the very beginning. John Starks despised him by the end of his run because he suggested that Hubert Davis was a better player than Starks, which was never true. So there was there were some things. There was a lot of self-inflicted stuff too, and I think really Don Nelson was a victim, if you could call it that, because he played into it, but was not. He later would become known as a player's coach, but I think he really underestimated like how powerful a locker room can be when it doesn't like a coach. And he had just lost his previous job because of like the Chris Webber stuff in Golden State. So the fact that he really hadn't taken note of how impactful a star player, a young star, or even older stars can be vocally, and that he would then go to New York and not realize that. Some people that I spoke to thought he was like actively trying to get fired and just get the leftover money on his deal because he just realized he was never going to win the fight between he and Patrick Ewing. So that was an interesting year for sure. Interesting 2/3 of a year. Cause think about it now. Can you imagine a Knicks coach getting fired with a winning record now? 34-25. They were in 4th place and he got fired before they brought in Jeff Van Gundy. So
I don't want to zoom into the present too much because this book is delightful. The Knicks win a lot in it. Any Knicks fan that wants to experience the team winning regularly will enjoy it. We don't need to talk about the contemporary Knicks. It's not fun for anybody. But that bit where you get to the end of this, he was fired with it's 20 games left in the season or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so conditioned by watching the Knicks now, and then also by, the way that it's just like debacle after debacle in terms of like just you laying it out. He was like, the record that he had was better than the record that any Knicks coach has had, except for like the 1 year that they went to the second round with Melo. Like it was just like, he was still like, they'd won 40 odd games. Like as a team, they haven't done that in the longest time. And I think as bad as that decision was, it's the only time until we get to the end of the book where James Dolan starts to sort of emerge as a presence in the organization, and then also as like sort of the character that he is now, where they make a decision that's very obviously bad and that doesn't work, and they unwind it quickly and with a relative minimum of drama relative to the way that the team operates now.
You're talking about Nelson still, that firing?
Yes, no, that's
okay.
So that was the mistake. But then as we get back to the end of the book where Dolan starts to sort of emerge and you start to see him putting his thumb on the scale, insisting that Ernie Grunfeld be fired because he doesn't like the way his wife acts in the luxury in the executive lounge and stuff.
Right.
Having too much fun.
This is the thing about the book that felt weirdest to me as someone who is a mostly disinterested observer in the Knicks, is that this was a period not really so long ago where they operated like a normal NBA team, even like a good NBA team.
Right.
And so obviously you can't tell the story of the last couple of years of the, because Dolan had taken over by 99 and, they went to the finals. It's, a proper capstone for the book. Culturally, in terms of knowing what you know about the team that you covered for the Journal for those years, what about this, I guess, was not just different, but that sort of surprised you in some way about seeing that the Knicks were once so different than the way they are now?
I don't know that this realization came to me before a week or two ago, but I feel like I've been asked the question more lately, is kind of just how much did Dolan fuck up this team is more or less kind of been the question. And I remember when I was pitching the book and, the publishers were bidding on it and stuff like that, the publishing houses were bidding on it. A couple of them just straight up asked, how big a part of the book do you expect him to be? And I kept saying, I hope not much, just because to me as an author, as a reporter, you want to take Anthony Mason is kind of a dream to write about from the standpoint that he's so layered and there's so many complexities. Dolan, on the surface, at least, seems to be kind of like a cartoon character, where it's just right. It's just everything is just negative, and everything, even if you frame it as positive, people are going to be oh God, why are you dressing him up to make him look better than he is? And the record kind of speaks for itself. So I think what I would say that has surprised me a little bit is one, I didn't realize how much of an impact those Knicks had on today's NBA as it relates to just the rules changes that the Knicks brought about because of their physical play. Fundamentally, this is the NBA that NBA wanted back in the 90s. This is what they wanted to see eventually, is a game that was so rooted in skill and athleticism to where a team can't make up for their shortcomings through being just way more physical than everybody else. So that's one. But I think the more important one as it relates to Dolan is I walk away convinced that I don't think, I'm trying to word this properly because, depending on if there are enough people, I'll read a blog tomorrow and they'll pan me for saying this. I don't think it's quite as much his fault as I thought. Obviously, I draw a lot of straight lines between this was a really dumbass decision and point it in his direction or show that it was his call or his handling of it that really went left. But the reason I say that is I think Dolan obviously is the one common denominator of stuff was really good. And then all of a sudden it was really, really, really bad. But also Patrick Ewing was a part of that too. That when you have a guy that is legitimately a top 5, top 6 player in the league every year for 15 years, and you make the playoffs every one of those 15 years, that's easily one of the strongholds that hold stuff together, that can keep you afloat, even if other stuff is dramatic or crazy, which it was between Riley, Nelson, the stuff with Ernie Grunfeld, and, whether it was wives or anybody else, whatever. Ewing existed through all that and had the team winning and getting into the playoffs every year for a decade and a half. Then as soon as Ewing was gone, that ended. And the Knicks essentially have never had a consensus top 5 player since then. Melo had maybe a year or two where I think you could put him in that conversation. He finished 3rd in MVP voting one year, and then he was fantastic the next year, I think, up until he got hurt. So we could have that conversation. And by the way, they were a really good team that year, that he was, 3rd in MVP voting. So maybe if that was an every year thing, we could have that conversation. I think that was the hope when they traded for Melo. But I think having a superstar insulates you, even from having like a really bad owner. Think about it. And this is the way I've pitched it, in the last couple of days as I've talked about this. LeBron won a championship in Cleveland. Like Dan Gilbert, nobody is like singing Dan Gilbert's praises as an owner, nor like the Phoenix Suns are like 8 or 9 games up and their owner's under fucking investigation right now.
Like he might be the one guy that ever gets fired from owning an NBA team. He's such a pud.
I had a
Donald Sterling.
Donald Sterling, yes. But if that's your bar, like, so he's this close to that.
Right. But that's where we're at though. It's like that Robert Sarver, like they added Chris Paul, and granted, they might have been on the upswing anyway with the younger roster that won the 8 games in the bubble. So they were starting to show some positive signs anyway, but you can win games with a horrible owner. Like it's possible. You can certainly at least have bigger stretches than the Knicks have had with Dolan, who's always been willing to spend. That's never been the problem. It's just the other stuff that's ridiculous. So the fact that there's been an absence of a superstar for 15 years in a market that you thought the market alone would be able to draw a superstar, I think is one of the biggest things I point to, because if LeBron had come here, not here, but to New York, like there's no question in my mind that the Knicks would have won something or at least been in contention, but they haven't had anybody of his caliber, even close, really. Carmelo being the closest thing they've had, and he's still a flawed player, even in his prime. I think that speaks volumes, and I think it says a lot, even if you think Dolan is the main reason for that.
I had a friend who worked for the Fuse Network, which was a music video thing owned by Cablevision, and
it's across the street still, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
They were all required to go see JD and the Straight Shots one time, 10 o'clock starts, and they signed them in. You had to show up. You had to show up for Jimmy's Blues Band.
Jimmy was playing a bringer show.
It was the bringer, and I believe he had rented out BB King's, and you weren't required. You weren't required to wear a pork pie hat, but if you did,
I mean, he had Carmelo and Amari Stoudemire on stage with them the one time with like the kazoos. I think that was several years back, but that made the rounds. Trust me, that made the rounds. Yeah.
Hope it was not the Trayvon song. I really hope.
Yeah, that song is not. Yeah. Oh my God.
Turning
that
the
was the title of it. I should have
quickly.
known, right?
Yes.
I sent this to you when I asked you to come on the show. So I've been dining out on this story for years. That it was my 23rd birthday, and my girlfriend, who's now my wife, we came down, like said, hang around the garden, and there was a guy scalping tickets, and it was the end of the first quarter. This was Bulls Knicks second round, the year Jordan was playing baseball, and he sold us 2 tickets for $25. And I've been telling people for years that I got to see Jordan-less, but Bulls Knicks in the heyday for $25. I dug this ticket out, it cost $25. So you could see the Bulls Knicks Eastern Conference second round
A different
for
era.
$25. I guess it's getting to 30 years. It's been a long time, but I was sure I had gotten quite a deal on that. One thing I want to ask you before you do get to the Q&A, this book made me realize, I think the Knicks on the whole, from just as an effort, as a unit, might have been a little better than I thought. I thought they were sort of all sweat equity all the time, and that was it. They were better than I thought, although weirdly, I think their offense was also not as good as I thought.
The offense was worse than you thought.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, that's the part I remembered correctly, was that they were like, they struggled to score 70 points in 2 hours.
I thought there was a big difference. I thought there was a big difference between Bulls Knicks, Heat Knicks, like the early to late 90s. I thought there was a big difference in their offense.
The Heat had more offense. Yeah, no, they were not like that's what I hope maybe someday I'll do like a straw poll. I hope I didn't make them come across as too untalented in this book. I think that their grit was what stood out about them and what will be remembered about them. Again, they were number 1 in the league. I think to this day, there might be one team since then that has had the number 1 defense and efficiency 3 years running. But I'm pretty sure that maybe the 93, 94, 92, 93 Riley Knicks still have like the biggest gap between them and the rest of the league in terms of how good they were defensively. In terms of efficiency, like they rank really high up there. In that 3-year run, you could put up against maybe some of the best in NBA history. Now, granted, they were intimidating and that was by design, but there was skill involved too. I mean,
maybe that's it, because you have the line in the book, I think the writer's Christmas says windshield wipers offer more variety than the Knicks offense. And
Yeah,
maybe it was just they had skill. Like Patrick Ewing, one of the greatest jump shooting centers. Maybe they had more skill than I realized. They just had no offensive creativity was what it was.
they
Maybe I don't
didn't have any
know.
good passers. Like I have the whole sequence in there about Starks and how Riley, shouted at him during one practice and said, "We're not going any fucking where till you can get the ball into Patrick without getting it stolen or getting it tipped." And he was their second best offensive player. Oakley, who had quite the revisionist history in his own book that came out a couple weeks after mine. He called Patrick the second option on the team and then said he was the third option. Oakley was the third option. I'm like,
I'm
but
glad you mentioned it. Oakley's jump shot was like a playground gag with me and my friends at that because we were in like 8th grade. And the way he would shoot would just like get real squared up and like rectangular and like super robotic. Yeah, it was. I mean, it wasn't the worst shot in the world. Like he was.
It went in a lot.
Yeah.
For their offense, it was one of the best, things they had, which that speaks volumes. So their offense was as bad as advertised. I mean, I think it's interesting though, because as I think about it, I think that team, I would probably have more questions about them defensively now if you took them into today's game than I would have about them offensively, because maybe that's crazy and sounds really backwards based on what I just said, but like Starks was a guy that led the league in 3-pointers made and, tied records, broke records for 3-pointers made in the game. Ewing was, an all-time great jump shooter for his size. Mason, we talked about being a point forward who was kind of ahead of his time. Oakley could hit like a mid-range jumper. Charles Smith was a guy that could do that too. And really, I think is the one guy that they should have gotten way more out of, if not for being like misused maybe by Riley and asked to play out of position. I think offensively, like they actually weren't horrible, but they just had no spacing and they weren't utilizing spacing in the best way. Defensively, I think that like they didn't have any guys that were super, super quick. Starks was undersized. He was maybe 6'2" or 6'3" and was listed at 6'5". And the fact that he was able to like kind of give Jordan a run for his money defensively and forced him into tough jumpers and into bad games from time to time. But the fact that you would be able to take away their intimidation factor because guys would get suspended for 9 years if they did what the Knicks were doing back then. I don't know how they would defend in space, really. Maybe somebody like Mason would, even him, was just such a big dude. I don't know that they could really cover the ground well enough defensively, but offensively they had some skill, but there was no passing and it was so slanted toward Patrick and John that they really were out of options. Derek Harper was a guy that I think was really good though, but defensively Harper was like the king of the hand check, which was legal. They were very good at pressuring the ball. It was hard to go to the basket against them. Starks was a pest. Greg Anthony was a pest. They were actually really skilled defensively. I just don't know that it would translate in today's game at all.
We usually run a clip at this point, but we have 3 questions, so we're going to skip it. I wanted to say, like I said, I moved to New York this year. It's like this most sophisticated city. I was just insane. And then I wanted to play 45 seconds of Go New York, Go New York, Go to show that this town is just as bumpkin and stupid as every other town in the world. The close-ups of the Knicks singing the song by the guy who became a millionaire apparently and owns the
All
Hawks.
of them somehow,
That's it. Yeah.
Go New York, go.
Yeah, as corny as every other city in the world. First question from Brian Stab. What did you learn about Patrick Ewing's demeanor and background that may have influenced his protracted path to a head coaching gig after finally breaking through at Georgetown? And did you have to listen to any JD and the Straight Shots? You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer it because hell no. I mean, like that might have put a knife in the whole project from the beginning. Yeah, I mean, I think I learned what was in the book really. That I think you'd be crazy if you said that somehow Patrick's quietness and kind of cold demeanor, at least the way people perceived it, if you think that didn't impact how long it took him to become a head coach, you're crazy. Like it absolutely did. That is the face of your program. If you're a college program, if you're a pro team that doesn't have a superstar, the coach, and even sometimes if you do, like if you've got a superstar coach like Riley, that is the face of what you're doing. And you can't generally, like, you're going to get the benefit of the doubt a lot of times as an organization when the person you put out front is eloquent and smiley and can kind of just make you forget. Hell, I've been on podcasts with Zach Lowe, you know, for my money, you know, the best writer in basketball, who we laugh all the time about guys that smile and engage you when you're talking to them. But then you know, and you think you've got this great hour-long interview with them, but then you look back at your notes and there's nothing there, and that they just haven't told you anything informative. Derek Jeter did it for years, and it's like Derek Jeter wasn't any more warm than Patrick Ewing really was, but he just engaged you enough to make you feel like you got something meaningful out of the conversation. Ewing wasn't interested in playing that game, which, you know, I understood it and I went into why. The guy dealt with terribly racist treatment through high school, through college in Boston, which, you know, people still make jokes or, you know, whatever you would like to call it about Boston and maybe not being the most tolerant place for Black people, or at least that feeling or that perception. It certainly was not, you know. If you look at some of the photos and just read up on the history during the 60s and 70s, when busing and integrated busing was kind of being brought into Boston and the Boston suburbs, it was a pretty rough place for young Black people. So, you know, all that I think played into it. Also that he was not great with the accent and the language and stuff when he first came over from Jamaica. So all that stuff factored in. I think John Thompson being his coach and being a man that protected and kind of cordoned off his players from the media a lot was a factor in it too. And just kind of basically, if you don't want to talk, you don't have to. So he would talk and do kind of the bare minimum with the media, but rarely opened up. And I think that influenced a lot about how quiet he was. And I think only once he was trying to get jobs at the professional level and being an assistant, you realize the only jobs he got in the pros were ones where he was working for someone that he had ties to. Michael Jordan and those Wizards teams. And obviously Michael's one of his best friends. Jeff Van Gundy when he coached the Rockets, and then Stan Van Gundy when he coached in Orlando. So that's basically it. When you look at it, might have been Michael's Bobcats teams.
So I think I talked to Jack McCollum about the Dream Team book, and only two guys on the Dream. There's only two guys he didn't interview for the book. I believe Karl Malone was the other, and then Ewing. And I was kind of like, is there any reason why? He's like, I just knew it. What I wasn't going to get anything to use. I talked to him.
And Malone had a good reason.
And Malone, so it was
Malone basically was like HIV phobia, you know, with Magic. So like nothing that he could say was going to make that look better. Also, Malone has some skeletons in his closets that I think a lot of us know about. Ewing is just like a pretty good dude. Like everybody loves him. Larry Bird, it's like his favorite person of all time. But yeah, Patrick is very reluctant to speak. I think he was going to speak for this one. I think we might be running out of time, so I don't know if I'll be able to share the story. But I think he had agreed to talk to me, and I'd met him and everything. And I think I made a little bit of a reporting mistake. I think that anybody could have made. Maybe as a first-time author, I certainly was doing what I needed to do. But I think it got back to him that I was asking questions about some of his extramarital stuff. He ended up having an affair with the team dancer. And I've asked someone that I didn't realize is actually still really close with Patrick that knew about some of the scandal stuff. And so I was asking the right questions to the right person. But I asked her before I actually spoke to Patrick for just my normal questions I needed to ask him. So I think she might have told him that I was asking questions about it. And I think that he was like, oh, this isn't just like a smile and grin sort of book. It's, you know, it's actually digging into those corners. So at that point, I stopped hearing anything back from Georgetown and Patrick.
Let that be a lesson. Have your affairs a lot discreeter. Don't go with the dance team. You want to do?
Yeah, I'll do the last question.
Do Eric's question, because this is a good one, and the team that we haven't mentioned, who is equally a part of this book.
You okay to stay like an extra minute or two, Chris?
I'm happy to stay. I just I didn't want to take up too much time of yours if you can't stay.
Obviously my brand is such that people know that I could stay here and talk about Gerald Wilkins all evening long. That's my damage. 90s Knicks versus Pacers was a rivalry that inspired intense animus from Hoosiers towards the Knicks and the broader Knicks universe, obviously. But in my experience, when talking to Knicks fans, as much as they hated the Bulls and Bulls fans, they hated Pacers and people from Indiana way more. How did the players and coaches feel about the Pacers? Eric asks.
Oh, they fucking hated them.
It comes through. If you like that, recommend this book.
So of the people I've heard from for the book, with the book, Spike Lee, obviously, not obviously. I mean, Spike Lee was one of them, and he will tell anybody that listens that he felt like, people wanted to hang him in Indiana and stuff like that, which, I don't think he's joking. Like, I think maybe a little bit, maybe he's being a little bit facetious, but I mean, I have in the book that he was called the N-word, and not something that he's telling me, but like reporters that were in the area told me. Jay Adonde, very well-respected, longtime NBA journalist. He's all throughout The Last Dance. He remembers hearing it really vividly. So, I mean, that was walking through Indiana during that series where Spike had kind of had the back and forth with Reggie Miller. But, the Knicks players remember being called out of their name repeatedly in those stands. I do think that they're probably, just 90s in general, when you think about all the things that the league was fighting from a perception standpoint, there probably was a ton of racism in some places, maybe everywhere at the time. We still see some of it now, quite frankly, as far as the players saying that they hear stuff in the crowds or hear stuff in certain stadiums. And the fact that Indiana, I think really Michael Jordan, it's kind of understood if Michael Jordan beats you all the time. Because Michael Jordan beat everybody all the time during those years. Reggie Miller was like kind of unique to the Knicks. And I think, quite frankly, if we're being honest, I think Reggie Miller, to some extent, his legacy was really built more by his matchups with the Knicks than anybody. Because you look at his numbers, and I remember thinking when I was building Patrick's chapter out, I said to myself, I've got to find a way to compare him to like the other guys of the era. Like, was he the best player of the era with the least amount of help? And as I was doing that, I was like, well, you obviously have to look at Reggie Miller and what he had with the Pacers. And I looked at him like, Reggie's numbers, Patrick was an all-star more than twice as many times as Reggie Miller was. Like, I don't think Reggie ever finished anywhere near the top of the MVP race the way Patrick did. Like, they were just in different stratospheres, but the way they're talked about is just kind of, they all kind of fall on that laundry list of guys that didn't quite get there because of Michael. But Patrick was way more accomplished than Reggie was. But Reggie legitimately hated the Knicks. The book I've got on my, it's got a book called I Love Being the Enemy is the title of it. The first line of the book is, I hate the New York Knicks. It's literally the first line of the book. So, he means it, the Knicks mean it. John Starks has a line in the book, which I got from another book, which is that he wanted to cut Reggie Miller's dick off and make him eat it.
That was a post-game quote too.
Yeah, wild,
like just
completely
way out of
wild.
pocket. Like, they're like, what would you work on for the next game? And he's like, well, I actually have a solution to our problem.
Completely wild. So I don't even know, man, when you think about stuff like that, like how do you, I'll never quite understand how that was a quote. But yeah, these guys did not like each other at all. And you could tell that it was a pretty real thing. It was not just something that was like made for television. They did not like each other.
Yeah, I definitely think basketball is better today, but the rivalries, that is the one thing I will give it up to the Gen X era. The rivalries were better because the teams didn't change anywhere near as much. And
I know
there was real, like, I wouldn't even know who the Bucks rival is. And maybe it takes a little while. I guess we could have had the best ever if the Cavaliers had been 30% better in those 4 Warriors runs, but
I know. Kevin
because
Durant
it doesn't really
changes
happen in
things
the
a little
finals,
bit.
but since we talked so much about him, let's wrap up real quick with this, just briefly in one section. Somebody want to know where to read you next, you can go to sportsillustrated.com.
Anything else we should know about though, Chris, like in terms of where people should or what they might be reading next?
I'll get in too much trouble if I say it. I'm trying to lock up a deal really this week, if not this week, maybe next week, for the next book proposal. It'd be another basketball related book.
Hell yeah.
I gave so much thought to other stuff, but I think this would make too much sense to pass up. So if I can get the green light on it, and get it, make the deal for it, then I'll put it out there. But hopefully in the next 2 weeks, but I don't want to jinx it or speak too soon. But I gave thought to a lot of stuff. Like I was thinking about Griffey. I was thinking about, maybe tap into 90s nostalgia a little bit more. Thought about the Sacramento Kings, which are a little bit after that. And I was like, it's a big gap to go from the Knicks fan base and how many people might buy that book to the Sacramento Kings. I thought about the Atlanta Braves from the 90s who did win one, but, lost more than they won as far as, on the grand stage. I thought about Deion Sanders. So I've thought about a lot of stuff, but I mean, there's one that kind of makes too much sense to pass up in my mind.
I'm in if you get a hold of Jason Williams, if there's a big Jason Williams chunk.
I mean, the Kings getting that like full decade treatment like the Knicks did. I mean, except for the very obvious fact that you would only like that it would just be Patrick Redford and his weird friends buying it. Like they deserve it as a team. Like it's absolutely
Yeah.
a layup to me. But
it's the same story. It's just,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a team that had a nemesis. There's betting involved. There's, there's the, or maybe not betting, but like there's, Tim Donaghy. There's the idea that was maybe the worst ref game I've ever seen in any sport at any level. There's the fact that they will break the record this year for most seasons without a playoff appearance.
Right.
With 16, they are a team that almost lost a city that almost lost their team. Stuff has gotten so bad and so, desolate at times. I don't think they're quite as intriguing. I mean, I think some guys are, but I think that the Knicks were maybe a little bit more interesting. And my thing when I really think about it, because like I don't mind doing a book that maybe it doesn't have like the biggest sales power, but like you've got to have some, because like that dictates, for people that don't know, that dictates how much you get for a book more than anything, is how many people will buy this. And even if you're really accomplished, even if you're a bestseller, what have you. For me, my thing is with the Knicks, you could at least say that they changed the way basketball is played for the 90s, and that they were involved in like everything, from the OJ chase to the Bulls and the Michael rivalry and the Pacers and the Heat and Riley and all that stuff. You can explain pretty clearly how, between those things and the fact that the rules changed because of them and their feuds with the league, quite frankly, that they influenced a lot of the way the sport would change. Can't put my finger on it immediately, like the way the Kings changed basketball. They were ahead of their time in certain ways, certainly. Great passing team. They had a lot of floor spacing. They played up tempo. But I don't know that like I could honestly say, at least without having researched it, that they fundamentally changed like something that we look at now. We're like, oh, that's because of the Kings. Maybe some things, but not to the extent that the Knicks did, on top of the fact that it's a much smaller fan base. But I think that they'd be a fascinating story.
Yeah.
And it kind of hurt me a little bit
changed the way
not.
that, they changed the way that I wore
was-
shorts for a while.
And also, I think Vlade was the last locker room halftime smoker. So that's
Yep.
him and Jim Leland held it down.
Yeah.
And we didn't even get this is a book. There you go. It's very good, very entertaining.
Yeah. Great time
And
for everybody.
If you haven't read it, you can get it at Greenlight for 10% off.
Ooh.
And we didn't even cover Xavier McDaniel's erections on this show. So
Yeah.
that's a little
We did not.
That's
We
a
did
little
not.
Easter. That's a little Easter egg for any
The
Knicks
Squawkin
fans
Sports
out
After
there.
Dark material there. It's-
So we're if anyone watches the show on the regular, we are doing every other month now. Mostly because we're supposed to be going back to do some live events at Greenlight, and that sort of changes the equation. That doesn't matter. But May 12th, that's the Thursday. Put it on the calendar. We are hoping to do the Ricky Henderson book with Howard Bryant. That is our
Ooh.
hope.
yeah.
I'll be in the audience for that one for sure.
Yeah, that's what we're aiming for,
That'll be
and
great.
then just show up whatever it turns out to be. So have a good tournament. Go Marquette.
Sure.
Happy St. Patrick's Day to those who celebrate, my people. Take us out, please. Thanks,
Yeah,
Chris.
thanks
the book
very
is
much,
great.
guys.
It's really
Thank
good.
you guys so much
Yep.
for having me. I
Go
really
get it.
appreciate all of it.
The Knicks
Thanks,
weren't
man.
always terrible, kids. It's true.
All right, thank you all so much for being there, Patrick. That was a perfect outro. Make sure to pick up Blood in the Garden at Greenlight, preferably. And thanks all of you for being here. Have a great night.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.